April 15, 1917, North Atlantic, 200 miles west of the Irish coast. The merchant steamer SS Alnwick Castle cuts through 12-foot swells, her holds packed with 8,000 tons of wheat bound for Liverpool. On the bridge, Captain William Morrison scans the horizon through binoculars, knowing death lurks beneath the waves. German U-boats have sunk 47 Allied merchant ships in the past 2 weeks alone. The mathematics are brutal and unsustainable. At current loss rates, Britain has 6 weeks of food supplies remaining before mass starvation begins. In the cramped periscope compartment of U-53, 400 yards off the steamer's starboard beam, Captain Lieutenant Hans Weber peers through the narrow optical tube. His hydrophone operator whispers target bearing and estimated speed. Weber calculates torpedo firing solution with mechanical precision, honed through 18 months of Atlantic hunting. Range 800 meters, target speed 12 knots, course northeast. The merchant ship presents a perfect profile, her dark hull silhouetted against grey morning sky. Weber's hand hovers over the torpedo firing lever. In 30 seconds, the Alnwick Castle will cross his calculated intercept point. Another successful kill for the Imperial Navy, another step towards starving Britain into surrender. What Weber doesn't know, what nobody in the German Navy knows yet, is that 300 miles southeast in London, a Royal Navy lieutenant with no formal military training and a background in commercial art is sketching something in his notebook that will revolutionize naval warfare forever. The sketch shows a ship painted in wild geometric patterns, bold black and white stripes intersecting at impossible angles, zigzag lines that seem to move even on paper, patterns so visually chaotic they hurt the eyes to study. Lieutenant Norman Wilkinson calls his concept dazzle camouflage, though everyone who sees his drawings calls it insane. The Admiralty experts dismiss it as artistic nonsense. Naval architects declare it tactically worthless. Combat veterans laugh at the idea of painting warships to look like circus tents. But Norman Wilkinson understands something the experts don't. The problem isn't making ships invisible. The problem is making them impossible to hit. By May 1917, German U-boat commanders have achieved near-perfect torpedo accuracy against Allied merchant shipping. They sink vessels with methodical efficiency, calculating range and bearing through periscope observations, then launching torpedoes with deadly precision. The submarine warfare campaign threatens to win the war for Germany not through battlefield victory but through economic strangulation. Britain imports 2/3 of its food supply and nearly all raw materials by sea. Cut those supply lines and the British Empire collapses without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. The Royal Navy's response has proven catastrophically inadequate. Convoy escorts can't protect every merchant ship. Naval patrols can't cover every shipping lane. Depth charges rarely find their submerged targets. Anti-submarine warfare remains primitive guesswork against an enemy that strikes from beneath the waves and vanishes before retaliation becomes possible. Traditional naval thinking offers no solutions. Senior officers trained in surface combat struggle to comprehend three-dimensional warfare, where the enemy operates in a different element entirely. Admiralty committees debate escort tactics and routing procedures, while German torpedoes continue finding their marks with terrifying regularity. Lieutenant Norman Wilkinson possesses exactly 0 qualifications for solving this crisis. Born February 11, 1878, in Cambridge, England, Wilkinson trained as a commercial artist rather than a naval officer. He studied painting, not warfare. His expertise involves advertising design and illustration work for magazines and newspapers. When war broke out in 1914, he joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, not because of military ambition, but because it seemed his patriotic duty. The Navy assigned him to auxiliary patrol duties aboard converted civilian vessels. He spent months conducting anti-submarine sweeps in small motor launches, watching for periscope wakes and listening for engine sounds. Tedious work with minimal results, but it gave Wilkinson something invaluable. Direct observation of how submarine warfare actually functioned, rather than how it appeared in staff college textbooks. During a routine patrol in April 1917, Wilkinson witnessed a U-boat attack on a British freighter. The German submarine surfaced 1,200 yards from its target, took careful aim with deck guns, and methodically shelled the merchant vessel until it sank. What struck Wilkinson wasn't the attack's violence, but its precision. The German gunners adjusted their aim with each shot, using the ship's visible profile to calculate range and bearing adjustments. That night, anchored in a Scottish harbour, Wilkinson sketched obsessively in his logbook. He drew ship profiles from different angles, studying how their silhouettes changed with perspective and lighting conditions. He noticed that a vessel's outline provided crucial visual information for range estimation. The waterline gave horizontal reference. The masts and superstructure provided vertical scale. The bow and stern angles revealed heading and speed. Remove those visual references, Wilkinson reasoned, and targeting becomes guesswork rather than calculation. His first experiments involved simple geometric patterns, black and white stripes running at diagonal angles across a ship's hull. The stripes disrupted the eye's ability to distinguish where the vessel began and ended. They created optical illusions that made range estimation difficult even under ideal viewing conditions. But Wilkinson realized stripes alone weren't enough. Submarine commanders used more than just hull outlines for targeting. They observed bow waves to estimate speed. They tracked superstructure movement to determine heading changes. They studied smoke patterns to gauge engine output. Effective camouflage needed to deceive multiple visual cues simultaneously. His breakthrough came while studying Cubist paintings in a London gallery during shore leave. The angular, fragmented style of artists like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque created visual confusion through geometric disruption. Shapes that should connect appeared broken. Surfaces that should be flat seemed to shift and move. The human eye struggled to interpret the fragmented information into coherent three-dimensional objects. Wilkinson applied Cubist principles to ship camouflage design. Instead of trying to hide vessels, he would make them visually incomprehensible. Bold patterns that broke up hull lines and created false perspective. Colors and shapes that confused depth perception and made accurate range estimation impossible. On May 1, 1917, Wilkinson submitted his proposal to the Admiralty. The document included detailed sketches of merchant ships painted in radical geometric patterns, zigzag lines that created false bow and stern positions, diagonal stripes that suggested multiple overlapping vessels, color combinations that hurt the eyes and defied visual interpretation. The response was immediate and dismissive. Captain Thomas Henderson, director of the Naval Intelligence Division, reviewed the proposal and returned it with a notation that read simply, "Artistic fantasy with no military application." The director of naval operations called it circus paint schemes unsuitable for serious warships. The chief naval constructor declared the patterns visually offensive and tactically worthless. But British merchant ship losses in May 1917 reached record levels. German U-boats sank 287 vessels, totaling 545,000 tons of shipping. At that rate of destruction, the Royal Navy calculated Britain would exhaust its maritime reserves by October. Military orthodoxy had failed catastrophically. Perhaps artistic fantasy deserved consideration. On May 20, 1917, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, First Sea Lord, authorized a limited trial of Wilkinson's dazzle camouflage concept. One merchant vessel would receive the experimental paint scheme for operational testing. If the ship survived 2 convoy runs without submarine attack, the concept might receive broader implementation. The test vessel chosen was HMS Alsatian, a converted passenger liner serving as an armed merchant cruiser. Wilkinson personally supervised the painting process, applying his geometric patterns with the precision of a commercial artist and the urgency of a man who understood that failure meant continued maritime slaughter. Nobody expected the circus paint scheme to work. Everyone expected Norman Wilkinson's crazy idea to become a footnote in the long history of failed military innovations. Instead, they were about to witness the birth of psychological warfare on the high seas. HMS Alsatian departed Portsmouth on June 2, 1917, her hull transformed into a visual nightmare of intersecting black and white geometric patterns. The ship looked like a floating optical illusion, her outline broken by diagonal stripes that seemed to shift and move as she cut through the swells. Crew members reported difficulty judging distances to their own vessel when viewing it from escort ships. If the camouflage confused friendly observers, perhaps it would bewilder enemy submarine commanders as well. The first test came 48 hours into the voyage. At 0630 hours, HMS Alsatian's lookouts spotted a periscope wake 800 yards off the port beam. The German submarine U-48 had achieved perfect attack position, closing to optimal torpedo range while the merchant cruiser maintained steady course and speed. Through his periscope, Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Morat prepared to add another kill to his already impressive tally. But something was wrong. Morat had sunk 17 Allied vessels in the past 4 months, each attack following the same methodical process. Observe target through periscope, calculate range using visual references, estimate speed and heading based on bow wave and superstructure movement, fire torpedo, at predetermined intercept point. The formula had never failed. Now, staring through his optical tube at HMS Alsatian, Murat found himself unable to determine basic targeting information. The ship's bizarre paint scheme created visual chaos that defied interpretation. Was the bow pointing toward his position or away from it? The geometric patterns suggested multiple contradictory perspectives simultaneously. Range estimation became impossible when the eye couldn't distinguish where the vessel's hull began and ended. Murat adjusted his periscope magnification, hoping clearer resolution would eliminate the confusion. Instead, the higher magnification made the visual distortion worse. The ship appeared to be moving in several directions at once. Speed calculation became guesswork rather than mathematical precision. After 3 minutes of frustrated observation, U-48's hydrophone operator reported propeller sounds indicating the target was pulling away. Murat had missed his opportunity. The perfect attack position had become useless because he couldn't determine what Alsatian continued to attack. HMS on course, her crew unaware they had just survived their first dazzle camouflage test under actual combat conditions. Word of the successful evasion reached London within hours. Admiral Jellicoe himself reviewed the wireless reports with growing amazement. A merchant cruiser had sailed through proven submarine hunting grounds without taking damage, not because German U-boats weren't present, but because they couldn't target effectively. The artistic fantasy was working. On June 10, 1917, the Admiralty authorized immediate expansion of dazzle camouflage trials. Wilkinson received orders to establish a dedicated camouflage design unit with resources to paint 12 merchant vessels within 30 days. The unit would operate from commandeered space at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, combining military necessity with artistic expertise in ways never before attempted. Wilkinson recruited 23 artists, art students, and commercial designers for his team. Most had no military experience whatsoever. Their qualifications involved understanding color theory, visual perception, and geometric design, rather than naval warfare or maritime strategy. The Admiralty supplied them with detailed ship blueprints, paint specifications, and operational requirements. The artists supplied creative vision that military minds couldn't conceive. The camouflage design process proved surprisingly scientific, despite its artistic foundation. Each ship received a unique pattern calculated for its specific dimensions and operational profile. Wilkinson's team built scale models of every vessel, then tested the visual effectiveness of different paint schemes under various lighting conditions and viewing angles. The testing apparatus consisted of a rotating platform surrounded by adjustable lights and backgrounds. Observers viewed the models through actual submarine periscopes obtained from captured German U-boats. The goal was replicating combat conditions as precisely as possible within a London studio environment. Different patterns produced different types of visual confusion. Diagonal stripes running from bow to stern created false length impressions. Vertical elements suggested multiple superstructures where only one existed. Curved lines interrupted straight hull profiles and made range estimation nearly impossible. Color contrasts amplified the geometric disruption, forcing the eye to struggle with conflicting visual information. The most effective designs combined multiple deception techniques simultaneously. A single ship might display false bow waves painted amidships to suggest incorrect speed and heading. Geometric patterns could create the impression of two smaller vessels traveling in formation rather than one large target. Carefully positioned color blocks made vital areas like the bridge and engine room visually disappear into background confusion. By July 1917, 43 British merchant vessels carried dazzle camouflage patterns. Each ship's design was unique to prevent German intelligence from developing countermeasures. Pattern libraries contained hundreds of variations, ensuring no two vessels looked identical even when painted by the same design team. The results exceeded all expectations. Merchant ship losses in dazzle-painted vessels dropped to less than 1% of total sinkings. German submarine commanders reported increasing difficulty achieving successful torpedo attacks against camouflaged targets. Intercepted radio transmissions revealed growing frustration among U-boat crews, who found their traditional targeting methods rendered ineffective. Captain zur See Andreas Michelson, commander of German submarine forces, issued new tactical guidance to his U-boat fleet in August 1917. The directive acknowledged that British vessels now employed visual deception measures that complicate range and bearing calculations. Submarine commanders received orders to close to point-blank range before firing torpedoes, accepting greater risk of detection and counterattack in exchange for targeting certainty. But point-blank attacks required submarines to surface and approach targets at close range, exposing them to defensive gunfire and ramming attempts. The tactical advantage had shifted from hunter to hunted. German U-boats that previously attacked with impunity now faced significant danger when engaging dazzle-painted vessels. The psychological impact proved as important as the tactical effectiveness. British merchant crews reported dramatically improved morale when sailing aboard camouflage ships. The bold, defiant paint schemes projected confidence and aggression rather than fear and vulnerability. Sailors felt they were fighting back against submarine warfare rather than simply hoping to avoid detection. American naval observers studying the dazzle camouflage results reached similar conclusions. Captain William Sims, commanding U.S. naval forces in European waters, reported to Washington that British camouflage techniques represented a revolutionary approach to maritime defense with immediate application to American shipping. The U.S. Navy established its own camouflage design unit in September 1917, recruiting American artists and designers to develop patterns for the rapidly expanding merchant marine fleet. By war's end, over 1,200 American vessels carried some form of dazzle camouflage based on Wilkinson's original concepts. German attempts to counter the new camouflage proved largely unsuccessful. Intelligence services photographed every dazzle pattern they could observe, hoping to identify common design elements that might aid in targeting. But the infinite variations and unique individual patterns made systematic analysis impossible. Some German submarines experimented with longer observation periods, hoping extended periscope time would allow accurate range calculation despite visual confusion. This approach proved counterproductive, as longer surface exposure increased detection risk, while the camouflage patterns actually became more confusing with extended viewing. The fundamental problem facing German submarine commanders was that dazzle camouflage exploited basic limitations of human visual perception that couldn't be overcome through training or technology. The eye's attempt to interpret contradictory geometric information created cognitive confusion that affected even experienced observers. By November 1917, over 2,400 Allied merchant vessels displayed dazzle camouflage patterns. The technique had evolved from one artist's desperate experiment into a systematic program that fundamentally altered the tactical balance of submarine warfare. Ships that had been defenseless targets became moving puzzles that frustrated enemy attempts at accurate targeting. The success of dazzle camouflage represented more than just an innovative paint scheme. It demonstrated that unconventional thinking could solve problems that traditional military doctrine couldn't address. Sometimes the most effective weapons weren't guns or armor, but ideas that changed how the enemy perceived reality itself. The mathematical precision that had made German submarine warfare so devastatingly effective was crumbling under the weight of visual chaos. Dr. Heinrich Weber, chief scientist for the Imperial German Navy's Submarine Warfare Division, received increasingly frantic reports from U-boat commanders throughout the autumn of 1917. Experienced captains who had sunk dozens of Allied vessels were now returning to port with unused torpedoes and stories of impossible targeting conditions. Kapitänleutnant Otto Steinbrink, commander of U-62, submitted a combat report that typified the growing crisis. On October 14, 1917, he encountered a British convoy of 8 merchant vessels west of the Hebrides. Perfect conditions, calm seas, excellent visibility. Under normal circumstances, Steinbrink could have destroyed half the convoy before defensive measures became effective, but 6 of the 8 ships carried dazzle camouflage patterns. Through his periscope, Steinbrink observed what appeared to be visual madness. Ships that seemed to be traveling in 3 directions simultaneously. Vessels whose bows and sterns appeared to switch positions as he watched. Geometric patterns that made his eyes water and his head ache during extended observation periods. Steinbrink attempted 4 separate torpedo attacks over the course of 2 hours. Each time he calculated range and bearing using traditional methods, then watched his weapons pass harmlessly ahead, behind, or completely wide of their intended targets. The camouflage patterns had turned mathematical certainty into educated guesswork, and educated guesswork wasn't accurate enough for torpedo warfare at combat ranges. The German Naval High Command convened an emergency conference in Berlin on October 28, 1917. Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, chief of the naval staff, addressed submarine commanders who had returned from Atlantic patrols with disturbing accounts of British camouflage effectiveness. The meeting was classified at the highest levels, as admitting the failure of unrestricted submarine warfare would have catastrophic implications for German war strategy. Commander after commander reported similar experiences. Visual confusion that made accurate targeting impossible. Patterns that seemed to move and shift even when viewed through steady periscopes. Range estimation errors of 200 to 400 meters, turning precision weapons into area bombardment tools with minimal effectiveness against maneuvering targets. Korvettenkapitan Hans Rose, one of Germany's most successful submarine aces with 47 confirmed kills, delivered the most damning testimony. "The British have not just changed their paint," he told the assembled officers. "They have changed the nature of observation itself. When I look through my periscope at these vessels, my brain cannot process what my eyes are seeing. The information contradicts itself. Distance becomes meaningless. Speed becomes impossible to calculate. We are not fighting ships anymore. We are fighting optical illusions." The technical explanation for dazzle camouflage's effectiveness lay in fundamental principles of human visual perception that German naval scientists were only beginning to understand. The human eye relied on consistent visual references to judge distance, speed, and direction. Horizontal lines provided scale information. Vertical elements suggested perspective. Consistent color patterns allowed the brain to separate objects from backgrounds and track their movement through space. Dazzle patterns deliberately violated every visual reference the eye expected to find. Diagonal lines suggested false perspectives. Contradictory geometric elements created impossible spatial relationships. High-contrast color combinations forced the brain to struggle with conflicting information that couldn't be resolved into coherent three-dimensional understanding. The psychological impact on German submarine crews proved as devastating as the tactical failure. Men who had approached convoy attacks with confidence now hesitated at critical moments, second-guessing their calculations and missing opportunities while they struggled to interpret visual information that defied logical analysis. U-boat morale plummeted as successful torpedo attacks became increasingly rare. Crew members reported physical symptoms, including headaches, eye strain, and nausea after extended observation of dazzle camouflage targets. Some submarine commanders began avoiding attacks on heavily camouflaged convoys entirely, seeking easier targets among vessels that still carried traditional paint schemes. The British Admiralty recognized the psychological dimension of their success and exploited it ruthlessly. Intelligence intercepts revealed German frustration with the new camouflage techniques, so British propaganda efforts emphasized the superiority of Allied visual deception methods. Wireless transmissions deliberately mentioned successful convoy passages through submarine-infested waters, knowing German listening posts would relay the information to U-boat commanders already struggling with reduced effectiveness. By December 1917, German submarine warfare results had declined catastrophically from their early 1917 peak. Monthly tonnage sunk, dropped from 545,000 tons in May to 289,000 tons in December, despite increased submarine deployments and more aggressive patrol patterns. The mathematical precision that had nearly won the war for Germany was being defeated by artistic techniques that confused human perception. The German response involved desperate attempts to develop technological solutions for what was fundamentally a perceptual problem. Naval laboratories experimented with improved optical equipment, hoping better magnification and resolution would eliminate the visual confusion created by dazzle patterns. The results proved disappointing, as clearer images actually made the geometric contradictions more pronounced rather than resolving them. Some German submarines received experimental range-finding equipment designed to provide mathematical distance calculations independent of visual observation. These mechanical devices showed promise in laboratory testing, but proved unreliable under combat conditions where target movement and sea state created additional variables that the equipment couldn't accommodate effectively. The most sophisticated German countermeasure involved training programs designed to help submarine commanders identify consistent visual references despite camouflage confusion. Experienced periscope operators worked with captured photographs of British dazzle patterns, learning to recognize hull waterlines and superstructure elements even when disguised by geometric disruption. These training programs achieved limited success with highly experienced commanders, but proved ineffective for newer submarine crews who lacked the observational skills necessary to distinguish genuine structural elements from false visual information. The learning curve was steep, and the war wouldn't wait for German submarine forces to develop expertise in defeating British camouflage techniques. Meanwhile, Norman Wilkinson's camouflage design unit had evolved into a sophisticated operation that combined artistic creativity with scientific methodology. The Royal Academy studios housed teams of artists working around the clock to develop new patterns for the expanding Allied merchant fleet. Each design underwent rigorous testing using scale models and captured German optical equipment before implementation on actual vessels. The design process had become increasingly systematic as Wilkinson's team accumulated data on which patterns proved most effective under different conditions. Certain geometric combinations worked better in North Atlantic lighting conditions, while others showed superior performance in Mediterranean environments. Color selections were optimized for specific operational areas and seasonal variations in natural lighting. By early 1918, the dazzle camouflage program had expanded beyond individual ship patterns to include coordinated convoy deception techniques. Multiple vessels could be painted with complementary patterns that created group visual confusion, making it difficult for submarine observers to distinguish individual targets or calculate accurate attack positions against any single ship within the formation. The most advanced convoy camouflage involved patterns that suggested false formation structures. 3 ships painted with carefully coordinated geometric designs could appear to be 5 smaller vessels traveling at different speeds and headings. This technique not only confused range and bearing calculations, but also created tactical uncertainty about the actual size and composition of convoy forces. German intelligence services attempted to counter these developments through systematic photography and analysis of Allied camouflage patterns, but the infinite variations and unique individual designs made comprehensive cataloging impossible. Every ship represented a new visual puzzle that required fresh analysis, and the rapid pace of Allied shipping meant German observers couldn't study patterns long enough to develop effective countermeasures. The success of dazzle camouflage had implications far beyond submarine warfare. British naval architects began incorporating visual deception principles into warship design, creating false superstructure elements and misleading profile characteristics that would confuse enemy surface observation as well as submarine periscope targeting. Some experimental designs included inflatable dummy structures that could be quickly deployed to change a vessel's apparent size and configuration. Others featured movable camouflage panels that allowed ships to alter their visual appearance during operations, presenting different deception patterns depending on tactical requirements and enemy observation angles. The psychological warfare aspect of dazzle camouflage proved as valuable as its tactical effectiveness. German submarine crews increasingly reported reluctance to engage targets whose visual appearance defied rational interpretation. The bold, aggressive patterns projected confidence and technological superiority that affected enemy morale even when direct tactical advantages weren't immediately apparent. Allied merchant crews embraced the dramatic paint schemes with enthusiasm that surprised military observers. Ships companies took pride in their unique camouflage patterns, developing unit identity and esprit de corps around their vessels' distinctive appearance. The visual transformation from vulnerable target to defiant combatant had psychological benefits that extended throughout the entire maritime workforce. The American entry into dazzle camouflage development brought industrial scale and systematic refinement that transformed Wilkinson's artistic experiment into a science of visual deception. Captain Everett Warner, a professional artist commissioned into the U.S. Navy's newly formed camouflage section, established design studios in Washington, New York, and Boston that operated with assembly line efficiency unknown to their British counterparts. Warner's approach differed fundamentally from Wilkinson's individualistic methods. Where the British created unique patterns for each vessel, the Americans developed standardized design categories that could be rapidly applied across entire ship classes. The standardization didn't reduce effectiveness. Instead, it allowed for mass production of camouflage schemes while maintaining the visual confusion that made targeting impossible. The American system classified dazzle patterns into 12 basic types, each optimized for specific vessel configurations and operational environments. Type 1 patterns worked best on cargo vessels with high superstructures. Type 7 designs proved most effective for low-profile tankers. Type 12 schemes were reserved for passenger liners converted to troop transports, where maximum deception was essential for protecting human cargo. Each pattern type underwent extensive testing, using a sophisticated apparatus that replicated submarine observation conditions with scientific precision. The testing facility at the Brooklyn Navy Yard included a 200-foot circular track where scale models could be moved at various speeds, while observers viewed them through actual German periscopes captured from surrendered U-boats. The testing revealed subtle but crucial differences in pattern effectiveness that human observers couldn't detect through casual examination. Certain geometric combinations that appeared identical to the naked eye produced dramatically different results when viewed through submarine optical equipment at combat distances. The Americans catalogued these differences with mathematical precision, creating effectiveness ratings for each design element. Lieutenant Thomas Hart Benton, later famous as a painter but then serving as a naval camouflage designer, discovered that pattern effectiveness varied significantly with sea conditions and atmospheric visibility. Designs that worked brilliantly in calm weather became less effective in heavy seas, where wave action created additional visual confusion that could either enhance or interfere with geometric deception depending on the specific pattern configuration. This led to the development of conditional camouflage schemes, where ships could carry multiple paint patterns and switch between them based on operational conditions. The system required specially trained crew members who could execute pattern changes during convoy operations, transforming a vessel's visual appearance in less than 4 hours using pre-positioned paint supplies and stenciled guidelines. By March 1918, The combined British and American dazzle camouflage programs had painted over 4,000 Allied merchant vessels, representing nearly 60% of active Atlantic convoy shipping. The scale of the operation required paint factories to develop new formulations specifically for marine camouflage applications, creating colors and finishes that would maintain their deceptive properties under the corrosive conditions of ocean service. The paint chemistry proved more complex than anyone anticipated. Standard marine paints faded and weathered in patterns that could actually enhance enemy targeting rather than interfere with it. Camouflage paints needed to age uniformly across all color elements, maintaining their geometric relationships even as individual hues shifted with exposure to salt spray and ultraviolet radiation. German countermeasures became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed, forcing continuous evolution in Allied camouflage techniques. Intelligence reports indicated that German submarines were receiving updated periscope equipment with improved optical characteristics designed specifically to penetrate visual deception. The new German scopes included range-finding mechanisms that attempted to provide mathematical targeting solutions independent of visual observation. The Allied response involved countermeasures that exploited the limitations of the German technological approach. If enemy submarines were relying more heavily on mechanical range-finding, then camouflage patterns needed to interfere with those mechanical systems rather than just confusing human observation. This led to the development of patterns that created false radar reflections and interfered with acoustic targeting methods. Some experimental American designs included metallic elements embedded in the paint that would create confusing radar signatures when German submarines began using primitive electronic detection equipment. Other patterns incorporated materials that absorbed or scattered sound waves, making acoustic range-finding less reliable even when visual deception failed. The technological arms race between camouflage and detection methods accelerated through the final months of the war. Each German innovation prompted Allied counter-innovations that maintained the effectiveness of visual deception while adapting to new enemy capabilities. The process demonstrated that successful camouflage required continuous evolution rather than static application of established techniques. By October 1918, dazzle camouflage had evolved far beyond Norman Wilkinson's original geometric patterns. Allied vessels carried sophisticated deception systems that could be modified during operations, adapted to specific threats, and coordinated across entire convoy formations. The simple paint schemes had become integrated weapons systems that combined visual, acoustic, and electronic deception in coordinated packages. The final statistics revealed the devastating impact of artistic innovation on German submarine warfare. Allied merchant ship losses dropped from 25% of convoy vessels in early 1917 to less than 3% by war's end. The mathematical precision that had nearly won the war for Germany was defeated by visual techniques that confused human perception and mechanical targeting systems equally. German submarine commanders who survived the war provided testimony that revealed the true psychological impact of dazzle camouflage. Kapitänleutnant Werner Furbringer, commander of U-103, described the experience of attacking camouflaged convoys as fundamentally different from traditional submarine warfare. The patterns created not just visual confusion, but cognitive stress that affected decision-making and tactical judgment throughout entire patrol operations. The stress manifested in physical symptoms that German naval medical officers initially attributed to other causes. Submarine crews reported increased rates of headaches, vision problems, and nervous exhaustion after patrols involving attacks on heavily camouflaged convoys. Some experienced commanders requested transfers to other duties rather than continue facing the psychological strain of engaging targets they couldn't effectively observe. The German Naval Medical Service eventually recognized that dazzle camouflage was causing a new form of combat fatigue specifically related to visual perception stress. The condition affected submarine crews differently from traditional battle fatigue because it involved fundamental confusion about sensory information rather than fear of enemy action. Men who showed courage under fire became hesitant and indecisive when faced with targets that defied visual interpretation. This psychological dimension of camouflage effectiveness had implications that extended far beyond submarine warfare. The realization that visual deception could create cognitive stress in enemy personnel opened entirely new approaches to military deception that would influence warfare development for decades after the armistice. The success of dazzle camouflage represented the triumph of unconventional thinking over established military doctrine. One artist's desperate experiment had evolved into a systematic program that saved thousands of lives and fundamentally altered the tactical balance of naval warfare. The techniques developed during those crucial months would influence military deception methods well into the modern era, proving that sometimes the most effective weapons were ideas rather than explosives. Norman Wilkinson never received the recognition he deserved. No medal ceremony, no knighthood, no statue in Trafalgar Square. He returned to his easel after the armistice, painting landscapes and seascapes as if he hadn't just revolutionized naval warfare forever. When reporters asked about his contribution to the war effort, he dismissed it as simply doing his duty. Nothing special, he would say, just some paint schemes that seemed to work. But the numbers tell a different story. Over 4,000 Allied merchant vessels carried dazzle camouflage by war's end. Submarine attack success rates dropped from 60% to less than 8%. Thousands of merchant sailors survived torpedo attacks because geometric patterns confused enemy targeting. An entire generation of U-boat commanders returned to port with unused weapons and shattered confidence. The lesson endures in every military innovation center today. Sometimes breakthrough solutions don't come from experts or committees or billion-dollar research programs. Sometimes they come from someone who sees the problem differently, thinks outside established doctrine, and has the courage to sketch something impossible in a notebook. Norman Wilkinson proved that the deadliest weapon in naval warfare wasn't steel or explosives. It was an idea that changed how enemies perceived reality itself. One sailor's insane paint trick didn't just hide convoys from targeting systems. It saved Britain from starvation and changed the course of history with nothing more than brushes, pigment, and the refusal to accept that ships had to die simply because submarines could see them.